and final installment of our World Affairs Council New Hampshire virtual event. We are so happy that you decided to join us this evening to engage with our community and the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire program. I do hope that you all are staying well, both physically and mentally, during these challenging times for our country, our state, and for our global community. With the coronavirus impacting so many facets of our lives, our families, our small businesses, healthcare, schools, and daily way of life, we hope that these WACNH gatherings can be a source of strength, engagement, and community for all. As some of you may know, if you tuned into our last event with Paul Pillar, my name is Maura Sullivan. I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I'm a proud board member for the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. And I want to take just a minute and tell you a little bit about the great work that WACNH has been doing. The World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to helping people better understand the challenges that are facing our world today. In the midst of the coronavirus global pandemic, we believe that it is more important than ever that Granite Staters have the chance to engage firsthand with the myriad complex global issues that all of us face. And it is our hope and intent as a council to provide a forum for discussion and engagement on these critical topics, thereby bringing the world to New Hampshire. As a membership organization, the council is supported by a generous community of global citizens. And these programs are made possible by members and donors, ensuring that the council's important work can continue. We thank and appreciate everyone who assists the council and hopes that if you are not yet a member, that you will consider joining or donating to help keep these programs alive. You can find more information on our membership on the website or make a tax-deductible contribution to the World Affairs Council by texting WACNH to 44321. And your help is so very much appreciated. We also want to thank our terrific sponsors who've made these virtual events possible. A sincere and hearty thank you to the John Bickford Foundation, to Charles and Barbara Bickford, to Stephen and Karen Barndollar, as well as Helen Taft and Peter Bowman. You are all wonderful supporters, and we thank you for everything that you've done to make this series a success. In addition, we would like to thank our mission partner, Southern New Hampshire University, for all of the support that they have provided over the past 20 years. The council is stronger for your assistance. For those for whom this is their first time watching one of the World Affairs Council New Hampshire events, welcome. We are so excited that you are here, and we hope you will join us and stay. We will be taking questions throughout the night. So please do send your queries our way so that we can have a full and robust discussion after Mr. Cronin's presentation. You can send your questions to our email address at council@wacnh.org or send them to one of our social media accounts. Finally, and most importantly, I'm so excited to get to introduce our speaker for this evening's talk. You know, prior to my own service in the Obama administration at the Pentagon, I served on active duty in the United States Marine Corps for a little over 5 years, during which I spent 2 years stationed in Southeast Asia and participating in joint military exercises in Japan, Korea, Thailand, and the broader Asia-Pacific theater. And I can tell you that we are in for a real treat tonight to have our guest speaker with us here virtually in New Hampshire. Dr. Patrick M. Cronin is the Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute, with his research program analyzing the challenges and opportunities confronting the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, including China's total competition campaign, the future of the Korean Peninsula, and strengthening U.S. alliances and partnerships. Dr. Cronin has a wealth of experience, having previously served as a senior advisor and senior director of the Asia-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security, or CNAS, senior director of the Institute of National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, director of studies at the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies, senior vice president and director of research at the Center for Strategic International Studies, as well as time spent at USAID and the U.S. Institute of Peace and more. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm Granite State welcome to Dr. Patrick Cronin.
Well, Maura, thank you so much. I'm honored to join you. And let me first begin by thanking Tim Horgan, Michael Pappas, and Diane Schaefer for the opportunity to address the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. Your wonderful organization connects my family ties to the Granite State, and I don't usually get a chance to talk about those family ties, with my longstanding interest in international relations. So if you indulge me just a bit, just a minute or two, I want to just speak about my mother's family because it sort of fits into the theme of tonight's talk. My first relative to reach North America sailed from France more than 400 years ago to work in the thriving fur trade. And my grandmother spent her 102 years in the Rochester area in the town of Milton. She was born in 1905, coincidentally, the same year President Theodore Roosevelt used a venue just 30 miles away in Portsmouth to broker the peace agreement between ending the Russo-Japanese War. And that marked the first instance in modern history that an Asian power defeated a Western power in combat. It also presaged brutal wars yet to come. And so in 1905, the US president's role demonstrated both America's growing interest in Asia that was going to only surge throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, but also Asia's growing importance to the world. Now, my meme was a rock. After her young husband died in a tragic fire, she raised 5 children, 4 sons and a daughter, as well as 2 other children she took in virtually on her own during the Depression. The oldest boy, Joe, served as a page at the Bretton Woods Monetary Conference in 1944, where world leaders planned the post-war financial architecture in New Hampshire. The second brother, Bob, a man I would later know as Crash, was at age 17 part of the American landing force at the Battle of Okinawa. Just June 22nd, 8 days ago, we marked the 75th anniversary of the end of that bloody battle. And it was in mid-August 1945, a few weeks later, when Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The formal ceremony ending World War II occurred September 2nd and ushered in a liberal new global and regional order in which the United States would play the dominant role. Only 5 years later, in late 1950, and at age 18, the third brother, Dick, found himself steaming to Japan and then on to Korea to parachute behind enemy lines to aid MacArthur in reversing North Korea's deadly gambit to seize the peninsula. And the youngest son, Homer, served in the Navy in the 1950s. Now, it was the stories of and about these New Hampshire boys, my uncles, that first drew me into Asia. They had an adoring and faithful sister in my mom, who also grew up in Milton and was about to enter a cloistered convent before my father, who had served in the Pacific and the Navy as well, persuaded her to marry him. My mom is the epitome of patience, calm composure on the exterior, but inside, New Hampshire tough. And admittedly, she's slowing down because now at age 91, she's talking about retiring. I remain very proud of her and my family. Their narrative is, in a tiny part, a narrative of the American narrative and New Hampshire's part in the American narrative. It's a reminder throughout my life that the world in general and Asia in particular are not abstractions, but they're inseparable from even small town New Hampshire. So let me pivot now to today's growing tensions in the vital Indo-Pacific region amid an ongoing global pandemic. And before I focus and highlight the problems, let me just underscore the tremendous success and dynamism of this region. The Asia-Pacific region encompasses the majority of the world's population, wealth, military power, and high technology. The United States, China, and Japan alone are the 3 largest economies in the world, accounting for almost a third of global wealth. And India's economy is projected to surpass that of Japan and the United States in the coming decades. One of the reasons US strategy now focuses on a free and open Indo-Pacific is because of India's rise. These powers all have their eyes on the vital sea lanes and critical choke points through which 90% of all goods are traded. Resurging major power competition is reflected in part by the fact that these countries account for most of the world's military spending. China, a traditional continental land power, now boasts the world's largest navy, largest coast guard, with a third navy, a maritime militia. And its overseas bases, something it always forswore, are beginning to crop up. The first one in Djibouti in East Africa, and now a series of dual-use ports and transportation hubs China's been financing and building to connect major resource centers of the world to China. And the mounting technological competition, where the 21st century economy will be won in fifth generation telecommunications, global positioning satellites, cyberspace, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. All of these technologies are centered on Asian competition largely, including with other countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and a handful of others, especially in Europe. But if the post-World War II era has empowered Asia's rise, this great success story, it has also kicked forward many unresolved problems. Decolonization, including India's independence in 1947, the post-war liberal world order, and the 1953 Korean armistice, left embers and ambiguities that could ignite into major conflict today. From undemarcated borders and sovereignty disputes to the Kim family dynasty's unrelenting nuclear buildup in North Korea and China's more assertive rise under Xi Jinping, tensions are rising across the Indo-Pacific region, even in the midst of the global pandemic. And US military forces in this region remain concentrated in Japan, especially on Okinawa, where my Uncle Bob was, and in South Korea, where Uncle Dick parachuted into because the North had invaded South Korea. But those forces are increasingly called into question by both the military and the non-military means of potential revisionist powers, especially China and North Korea. Now, let me put this in the context of the coronavirus that began in China last year, hence the COVID-19 name. It's infected more than 10 million people worldwide. It's killed more than 500,000 people, including 130,000 in the United States. And we remain months away from effective vaccines. Meanwhile, the economic fallout and the acceleration of nationalism and protectionism are exacerbated by the pandemic and in turn exacerbating major power competition, the fraying of longstanding alliances and partnerships. It's creating an era of anxious uncertainty. And I don't want to contribute to the anxious uncertainty. I actually am an optimist that we can manage this and get through this. Hence the reason I'm putting this in a historical context. But the pandemic is accelerating these myriad trends that point to a greater conflict, era of conflict, than an era of cooperation. So let me focus on 5 related regional flashpoints very briefly. Number 1, Hong Kong. 23 years ago in 1997, when Britain handed back Hong Kong to China, Beijing pledged to preserve Hong Kong's autonomy under the concept of one country, two systems. Hong Kong will not change for 50 years, Deng Xiaoping said, adding that after 50 years, there will be no reason to change. Now, semi-autonomy gave rise to a hope that Hong Kong could preserve its freedom and expand that freedom into universal suffrage. It bred an umbrella movement. Last year, we saw that with serious pushback on Beijing's erosion of autonomy of Hong Kong. So now, tomorrow, on the 23rd anniversary of the first handover of Hong Kong, Hong Kongers are feeling more like they are going through a second handover, as Beijing has suddenly and with great secrecy imposed a new 66-article long national security law that undercuts local rule and autonomy on the grounds that China had to crack down on separatism and subversion and terrorism and foreign interference. And so overnight, political opposition signs in Hong Kong have been torn down, social media accounts have been deleted. Life has changed just overnight in Hong Kong. One pro-Beijing lawmaker in Hong Kong tried to justify this reversal of the one country, two systems promise on the grounds that Hong Kong has been too free. Well, that's party propaganda. It's not truth. And as China faces an economic slowdown and political doubt, Xi Jinping is eager to demonstrate unity and strength, particularly as he heads toward 2021, which is the centenary, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. So Xi's reneging on a previous international pledge over Hong Kong is of special interest to the world, but it's of particular interest to the 24 million people on democratic Taiwan. And that's flashpoint number 2, Taiwan. Because ever since the Democratic Progressive Party candidate of Tsai Ing-wen won her first term as president of Taiwan 4 years ago, Beijing has stepped up economic, political, and military pressure on her to accede to China's understanding of the so-called 1992 consensus. President Tsai has steadfastly protected Taiwan's freedom without pursuing overt independence. But Tsai's re-election just this past January, just when the pandemic was quietly taking hold of China became more belligerent toward Taiwan. In addition to continuous cyber attacks, there have been 8 PLA Air Force exercises around Taiwan in the month of June alone. And threats to use force against Taiwan are uttered with greater frequency from both officials and media outlets in China. Now, Taiwan is always a delicate balancing act for US administrations that want to preserve the status quo. They want to keep Taiwan free from coercion and yet not jeopardize trade and other relations with China. The Trump administration has increased naval presence in and around the Taiwan Strait and supported enhanced ties short of official recognition. At the same time, former National Security Advisor John Bolton reports that President Trump spoke disparagingly of US obligations to Taiwan. If Xi thinks, that is, Xi Jinping thinks, he has a green light, an opportunity to unify with Taiwan free from US involvement, he could well seize the moment. So that would be a catastrophic mistake, and it could lead to a catastrophic miscalculation. That's how one of these flashpoints could flare up into major war, even though you wouldn't expect it. So it's a good thing the Trump administration is also keeping 3 aircraft carrier strike groups sailing in the waters offshore. And that brings me to flashpoint number 3, the South China Sea. Over the past decade or so, China has taken a more brazen approach to claiming the South China Sea as internal blue territory, using a 9-line claim covering some 90% of this vital body of water as its own domestic lake. A 2016 International Arbitral Panel at The Hague ruled that China's claim of historic rights was without basis in international law. But Beijing ignored the ruling, destroyed coral reefs, built artificial island reefs in the Spratly Islands that now provide military bases from which the People's Liberation Army and the Coast Guard can project control and power. At the same time, even during this pandemic, China has stepped up use of its paranaval forces, as well as oil rigs and survey ships, to harass, swarm, loiter, and ram the other claimant states of the South China Sea: Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei. It's also encroached on the waters around Indonesia's oil-rich Natuna Islands, and it's used lasers against Australian and other ships and airplanes sailing and flying on or above these international waters. Meanwhile, China has relied on the Belt and Road Initiative brand of infrastructure financing to co-opt leaders like Philippine President Duterte, who was on the cusp of canceling the US-Philippine Visiting Forces Agreement, the legal document that makes it possible to have military ties with the Philippines, until just recently, when Duterte, watching China's aggression and listening also to his own military and other political forces, caused him to reconsider and step back from the brink of ripping up a very critical alliance document. But it shows you how tenuous the security of this region is. Japan, Australia, and other international allies have done a lot to support the rule of law in capacity building within Southeast Asia, but there's no security institution, there's no NATO that can stand up to China. Beijing has been negotiating a code of conduct on behavior in the South China Sea for the past 18 years, ever since it reached a vague declaration of conduct, non-binding, with the 10 Southeast Asian countries of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. China knows how to divide and rule. And this year, though, Vietnam is chairing the ASEAN process. And Vietnam has been pushing back, including getting all 10 Southeast Asian countries to reaffirm the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and to insist on the preservation of overflight rights at a time when China might declare an air defense identification zone in the South China Sea, which would be another step for China to kind of legally show that it's administering and responsible and controlling the entire South China Sea. So it's useful to have carrier strike groups conducting dual operations in the Philippine Sea in a show of force. It's useful to have US and Japanese naval forces exercising in the South China Sea. All of that's been going on in the month of June. But while these tensions in the South China Sea simmer, India and China actually engaged in lethal combat along their disputed border for the first time in 45 years. And that's flashpoint number 4, the India-China border, the other side of the Indo-Pacific. For 5 hours on the night of June 15th, a few hundred Indian and Chinese soldiers rolled along parts of their undemarcated northwestern Himalayan frontier using spiked clubs, rocks, and other blunt instruments. 20 Indian soldiers, some from falling into the freezing water, died. While the Chinese have remained silent about their casualties, the Indians reportedly handed over 16 dead Chinese soldiers when the two sides disengaged. I think this lethal skirmish was precipitated by China's salami slicing tactics, that is, trying to recover inch by inch bits of territory and move the border to its advantage. Even though the Himalayas are called the world's roof and they're very remote and difficult to engage in. There are parallels to what has happened in Southeast Asia, in fact, and in the Himalayas. China deployed dredgers to create new facts in the water and the ground in the South China Sea when it built those artificial island reefs. Well, along the Himalayan frontier in the Galwan Valley and River, at the center of the recent Sino-Indian clash, China has been using earth-moving machines to create new real estate. Now, Xi and China are feeling both powerful and vulnerable. Powerful in that over the past decade, China's economic clout and military have grown, and Xi has traded in Deng Xiaoping's old idea of hide and bide philosophy, that is, conceal your strength, buy time, for wolf warrior diplomacy, brazen assertiveness, and even aggression. China's narrative is singular and unchallenged at home, at least officially. Beijing seeks to achieve a China dream that includes recovering lost territory and, along the way, burying the century of humiliation, as they call it, prior to the PRC's founding in 1949. The 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, the second centenary after next year's Chinese Communist Party anniversary, is meant to be the arrival of a fully rejuvenated China that is second to none. And while China has pursued a comprehensive approach I call total competition, military power is a key pillar of the strategy. Xi has implored the PLA to be prepared for modern combat, and he's ordered more realistic training and encouraged contact. And this clash with India marks the first People's Liberation Army combat deaths since 1985, 35 years ago. This is not a tested army that Xi has, but now he's spilled blood, and who knows where he goes from there. The brawl with the Indian army, though, also seems like an act of desperation. Having built better infrastructure over the years in this remote area, the Chinese are eager to slow down India's recent infrastructure improvements on their side of the line of actual control. Specifically, the PLA wanted to stop India's progress on a strategically important road, and better to dismember India now than wait for it to grow stronger, some Chinese may have reasoned. Chinese officials probably also thought they could leverage the superior tactical position now the way they did back in 1962 when the Sino-Indian War left hundreds dead, a couple of thousand, in fact. Back then, it was Nehru, India's leader, who thought that China was vulnerable because there were tensions between the Soviet Union and China, and he pressed forward to secure what he thought was the rightful border for India. That propelled Mao Zedong to gradually escalate tension and use of force in a policy he called armed coexistence. The real fighting broke out only in October, however, when China knew that the United States, the Soviet Union, and the rest of the world were preoccupied with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mao exploited favorable tactical positions that the PLA had built up in the Himalayas, and the PLA also had more recent fighting experience, having fought in the Korean War on North Korea's side. And they tried and did bloody the nose of Indian forces. And ever since 1962, China has played this history card against India to intimidate the Indians. And I think they've tried to do this once again, but Indians have come a long way since 1962. And after this lethal skirmish, I think we should probably expect Indian military investments to rise even further. Now, the fight in remote Galwan Valley may be a forerunner of an Asian century in which Asian powers are increasingly capable in competition with one another. It's not all about America. It's also a reminder that the Indo-Pacific peace and security are not all about the US-China competition. And a good place to segue for flashpoint number 5 is here, because North Korea is a continuing source of tension. It's been 70 years since the outbreak of the Korean War, and yet some 28,000 US troops remain on the Korean Peninsula, and the US-South Korean alliance ensures that the Kim family cannot use nuclear weapons without inviting its own annihilation. The North Koreans called it the Fatherland Liberation War, or the June 25 incident, or simply 625. And so with Stalin and Mao's blessing, Kim Il-sung amassed his heavy weaponry along the 38th parallel early that Sunday morning on June 25, 1950, and he launched a preemptive strike operation that pushed the underprepared South Korean and American forces all the way back to a Pusan perimeter that we almost lost. But American reinforcements, including my teenaged uncle, my mom's brother Richard, who literally parachuted in to be part of the reinforcements that were critically needed to push back the North Korean invasion, even backed by China at the end of 1950. Now, my Uncle Dick lost all the other men in his platoon but one, and combat altered him for the rest of his life. Max Hastings, the historian, called the Korean War the least expected of wars, in the least predicted of places, under the most unfavorable possible military conditions. It just reminds us that history is oblique. You don't really foresee when war could break out. And we're dealing with all of these flashpoints in the middle of a pandemic. The guerrilla war that Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, fought against the Japanese during World War II and the Chinese-Japanese war that continued through that war. It helped him to win the infighting and take control of North Korea after the peninsula was divided in two by Soviet Union and the United States at the end of World War II. Now, today, that guerrilla war is being waged by third-generation grandson Kim Jong-un, and more recently, his younger sister Kim Yo-jong, especially given Kim Jong-un's surprising, lengthy absences, 3 weeks at a stint in these past 3 months, 3 times. Undoubtedly, COVID-19 fear is part of this explanation, whether it's his heart, whether he has COVID-19, or whether he's just afraid of it. He's been in hiding much of the last 3 months. In the meantime, his younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, has picked up the mantle of brinkmanship with recent military threats that resulted in the demolition of a virtually brand new $8.6 million inter-Korean liaison facility on the North Korean side of the border, paid for by Seoul. It's worth recalling that President Obama told President-elect Trump 4 years ago that North Korea would be his major problem because North Korea was approaching the threshold of fielding nuclear-tipped intercontinental missiles that could hit the United States. Despite unprecedented summit diplomacy that elevated hopes of peace and denuclearization, North Korea is closer to that realization today than it was 4 years ago. Will there be an October surprise? Will the surprise come after our election? You can never predict North Korea's precise actions, but we can expect further provocations out of Pyongyang. And that's why this 5th flashpoint remains very precarious indeed. Now, in closing, I want to say that we have to be able to deal with these multiple flashpoints of interstate tension and complex crises like a pandemic. We have to deal with them at the same time, and we have to work with others on conclusions. I want to just say that this is going to take sacrifice. There's no victory without sacrifice. And I personally remain humbled by my uncle's attitude, who at a young age demonstrated such courage and selflessness to defend our country. From the Battle of Okinawa to the Korean War, America was thrust into the center of Asian Pacific security. Our aim today should be to seek neither hot nor cold wars, nor to police the world, but neither should we abdicate our leadership position. With wise action backed by strength and capable allies, we can avert disaster, deter conflict, preserve a free and open Indo-Pacific, and create a brighter future. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Patrick. We so appreciate you being here. That was absolutely terrific, and particularly for sharing the story of your uncles in New Hampshire and how that led you to Asia. As you know, as Granite Staters, we are very proud of the role that we played. Many residents of our state, and in particular of Portsmouth, of Newcastle, of Rye, in exercising citizen diplomacy that led to the Treaty of Portsmouth and the end of the Russo-Japanese War. We hope to be able to take you live on your next visit here to show you the kind of commemorative room that exists at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. And I'm sure if you haven't seen it, you'd enjoy it. And we really appreciate you sharing that story. I myself was stationed on Okinawa, and so just hearing about your Uncle Bob, brought back a lot of really, really wonderful memories. We've got questions that are coming in from all over our state here. This is really, really exciting. And so I'm just going to jump right in, and so we can, use the next half an hour to have a great discussion. First question that came up here is, is the U.S. losing ground or influence in the region? And would TPP have been an effective way of combating that?
Well, TPP stands for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and since the United States withdrew from the final negotiations on that agreement under the Trump administration, Japan has led an 11-member comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which now the British have been invited to and are trying to join, keeping the door open to the United States in the future. Now, if we go back to the 2016 election, we have to remember fairly that both major candidates opposed the TPP. So there was a disconnect between those of us in the national security field who looked at the leadership responsibilities, looked at the leadership potential of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and also the vacuum that would be created by withdrawing, which has been filled by China with its Belt and Road Initiative brand, even though that Belt and Road Initiative is very misleading. We see the debt that's being incurred by countries. And in fact, just a footnote on the Belt and Road Initiative, China is very boastful about the foreign assistance it's provided to places like Africa. But 97% of that assistance is not interest-free. So the Chinese like to talk about the interest-free part of the loans they've been giving to Africa and other parts of the world, but 97% of it is not interest-free. So the debt that's being incurred will either be paid for to the Chinese banks who want to collect by resource extraction, and indeed a lot of these financial arrangements are with resource-rich countries, or it'll be dragged out. Of course, the United States needs a strong trade and economic policy, and the absence of that has created a vacuum. So that has hurt us. I wouldn't just narrowly say it's TPP, but the point is we haven't been able to find a replacement that's adequate to TPP. So how are we moving backwards? I think China's been moving forward. I think the world is moving forward. And the pandemic has slowed us down and everyone down. So we are, in effect, have a very tall hill to climb in the Indo-Pacific, but not one that's insurmountable and not one that we alone could ever sort of deal with. We have to be able to mobilize others around a common purpose. And I think there we could do a better job as well.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of consistent themes I'm seeing here in the question, so I'm going to kind of combine a few of them. But the notion of not on my watch in the past was a strong sign of strength for U.S. presidents. What can the United States do vis-a-vis China and Hong Kong, and what are the implications for the U.S. If the Trump administration does not, act decisively as China, engages proactively with Hong Kong?
Well, again, Hong Kong is a very difficult place for us to get leverage beyond moral leverage, beyond political leverage. We have to shine a spotlight on what China does. And that's why we have to talk about the national security law that they've just by fiat imposed on Hong Kong against the promise that China itself made to the world into Hong Kong back in 1997. That's something we can do and we will need to continue to do because that has power. That's soft power, but that's important. We also can help countries take in Hong Kong citizens and money. Britain and Prime Minister Boris Johnson offered up to 3 million Hong Kongers to come to Britain. They're not going to come in those numbers, but that's certainly a possibility to be a safety valve, to get Hong Kongers who go to Taiwan, go to democracies and carry on their work. This is not abandoning Hong Kong, but the point is we can help some of the people of Hong Kong. Most importantly, though, not on my watch, is we have to make sure that deterrence holds on Taiwan. There we can do something because China really doesn't want to fight to unify with Taiwan, and we don't want to fight to have to protect Taiwan's democracy. We just don't want Taiwan to be having to kowtow to Beijing and being coerced into be a supplicant to Beijing. We want it to be a proud democracy that can carry on its freedoms. There, some defense and some forethought and some clear signaling can carry on this deterrence. That's why we have to make sure we don't send the wrong signals. We don't weaken deterrence about Taiwan, because there you could actually see brutal use of force. Hong Kong is part of China. We've accepted that. The Taiwan deal is more ambiguous.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about the way for the United States to leverage India as an ally in the region to try to curb the growth of Chinese influence?
Well, India is a marvelous partner. It's not going to be a treaty ally of the United States or anyone. It's going to carry on in its sort of own way. It created the non-aligned movement for a reason. And it wants to and is more aligned with the democracies, with the United States, with Japan, with Australia, with Europe than ever before. So we can continue to work with India, especially in its region, in the Indian Ocean, on high technology, on its economy, things that it has a vital interest in. When you talk about India action in Southeast Asia or East Asia, it gets a little more tenuous and difficult and a bit of a stretch. But even there, India is an important voice. For instance, when we talk about creating a code of conduct on how should navies and maritime aircraft and ships behave in the waters of the South China Sea, well, we shouldn't let China foist an unequal treaty, in effect, on the smaller Southeast Asian countries. And that's what it's been trying to do. Its single draft of a code of conduct would allow Beijing to have a veto over not just military exercises, but also economic exploitation of those seas. Well, we should draw up with other large maritime democracies like India and Australia and Japan what would be a fair code of conduct anywhere in the world, and let that be a code of conduct and challenge the Chinese to reach that standard. They won't, of course, but by showing that they're not really serious about a fair code of conduct, we continue to bring in large democracies like India, which is getting larger and larger, and is a real challenge. I mean, as I mentioned, it was the actual infrastructure that India has been building lately that China probably wanted to stop. And they thought they could get away with it in this remote area. And if anything, they could bolster their reputation as being combative and feisty and strong, and that India might back down based on history. India is not backing down. India is moving forward in the 21st century. We want them as a strong partner. They're going to be aligned with the democracies of the world. So that's a good bulwark to work with.
Great. Folks who are tuning in, we've got a lot of great questions coming in from all around our state. I'm seeing folks tuning in from Concord, from Hampton, from Manchester, North Conway. So please keep the questions coming. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And if you've already heard your question answered, don't hesitate to send us another one. And as I said, I'll try to get through as many as I can. But these are really, really terrific, and we very much appreciate the active participation. John Sullivan has a question for you, Patrick. Can you speak to the growing rivalry between Australia and China?
Yeah, this is a fascinating contest. I mean, you have to remember that Australia is a country of about 25 million people, but it punches well above its weight. It's a major economy in the world, and it's a major political democracy in the world, and especially an anchor for Indo-Pacific democracies. Under the surprising successful Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, somebody that people laughed off at first when he took over from Prime Minister Turnbull, he's been a phenomenal success. And he's now just announced a brand new visionary 10-year defense plan that would increase Australian defense spending. That he's also passing laws to stop possible Chinese interference in the financial markets, in real estate purchases, in buying technologies that are sensitive and critical in Australia. He's been a leader on standing up to China. And that's a tough position for any Australian politician to take, because China is so phenomenally important to the Australian economy. And the question is, will there be a backlash to Morrison and to this? And this is where, in our democracies, we always have to think about, okay, well, we can go so far, but if there's going to be a backlash that's going to undo everything we just did, maybe we need to find the sustainable approach in between. I think Prime Minister Morrison is finding his toughness right now, and he's doing a phenomenal job. but China has been unrelenting in political pressure, in economic pressure. Clive Hamilton is the Australian academic who's received a lot of attention lately. He's now written a second book on what is called The Hidden Hand, which focuses more on China recruiting and trying to influence British elites through trade and so on. It's not that the British are, being bought by the Chinese, but they're influenced, and you become sort of part of the coalition that supports trade, and then you start to downplay your own national security. Well, Clive Hamilton wrote a book called Silent Invasion a few years ago, which talked about the comprehensive way that Chinese, and the Communist Party of China in particular, including its United Front Work Department, which is responsible for literally controlling and outreach to the Chinese diaspora around the world and following Chinese students. And it really was a censorship, an espionage sort of operation on the part of China. And this has been something that the Australians have woken up to in the last 5 years. Australia has probably been at the forefront of this pushback on China compared to all the other so-called Five Eyes nations, including the United States, Canada, the UK, and New Zealand. Under the Trump administration, there's no doubt the United States, both sides of the aisle, have become far more open-eyed about China's activities. But then there's still disagreement over what do we do about this, because we're trying to balance both our security interests, which are being hurt, but our long-term economic interests, where we're tied into global trade.
You spoke extensively on the tensions, with North Korea and the provocations in the region and the impact that has on the Asia Pacific community as well as the global community. One of the questions that came in tonight is, does North Korea remain a reasonable threat? I think we all know that it most certainly does, but could you kind of extrapolate on that, as to what diplomatic paths forward that you might see, recognizing that this is a considerable challenge that, Bill Perry, Ash Carter, and, American leaders and diplomats have been working on now for decades. But I think we'd love to hear, your thoughts on what different courses of action might look like.
Well, again, Mara, if you take the long view, we've been successful at deterring North Korean aggression, not in 1950, but after that. So the so-called Second Korean War, the seizure of the Blue House, the South Korea's White House, and the seizure of the USS Pueblo, our sort of listening ship a few months later, all of that in the late 60s was a very tense time. There were casualties. North Korea was willing to use lethal force. We've seen very few instances of that since. 2010 was the last time that North Korea has consciously used lethal force to send a signal. That's when they sunk the small frigate, the corvette of the South Korean Navy in 2010, killing half the crew in the cold waters there in the West Sea. And they also then fired shells across the northern limit line, which is the maritime demarcated line, onto Yangpyo Island, killing a few people as well. But since then, they've been largely deterred. Now, interestingly, Kim Jong-un, this third-generation leader, who's disappeared a lot these last few months, he was overseeing those operations in 2010. He wasn't yet in charge. His father had had a stroke, but he was being groomed to take over. And he was taken under the thumb of the head of special operations and was allowed to maybe even roll the dice on what they wanted to do to show that he had the credentials to be ruthless. But for all the ruthlessness and all the provocation, the bravado and the provocation and building up nuclear weapons, North Korea really can't and hasn't been able to use successfully its lethal force. And it cannot fire these missiles and hit something outside of North Korea without an assured reprisal and a strong one. And so when Kim Jong-un sees, the capabilities of bombers or drones or other missiles outside, he's mostly trying to deter them from uprooting the Kim regime. He's looking for survival. The problem is that doesn't translate into cooperation. And so the idea that Kim Jong-un may have had for a summit meeting with President Donald Trump and with President Moon Jae-in of South Korea to bring about denuclearization and peace was very different from the idea that we had. It unfortunately didn't get any fruition. So North Korea remains very much a threat because it's increasing its missile arsenal. These missiles are getting faster and more deadly. They have, by the way, biological and chemical weapons. Remember that his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, was assassinated with VX nerve agent in Kuala Lumpur to partly remove another threat to the throne of this Kim dynasty. Now that he's Kim Jong-un's health seems to be in question, they're having to groom his younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, just to make sure that the Kim family can have some political legitimacy to sustain North Korea's regime. But they're not looking for war. They would love to unify the peninsula on their terms, of course. But unless we roll over and play dead or everybody leaves, that's not going to happen. So we have to clearly send signals that show strength and deterrence, but we don't have to hyperventilate about it. We don't have to react to every provocation and every brinkmanship statement out of Pyongyang. In fact, just the opposite. I think the Trump administration's original strategy, to the extent that the administration had a strategy, despite John Bolton's book about the president, was to kind of downsize the North Korean problem for America and for America's let America's allies take more, especially wealthy South Korea, and meanwhile work more on the competition with China, because that was the larger game for the United States. Mm-hmm. That's still a reasonable strategy, but how you execute it is very difficult, because North Korea is not going to help us here. They're not going to simply join the Western camp against China. They're not going to end the Kim regime, and they don't want to give up their nuclear weapons. So we're in a box, and we've not been able to break out of that box. I was helping Secretary of Defense Bill Perry back in those 90s, and General Shalikashvili, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, talk about the first nuclear crisis we had. That was the time when the United States seriously looked at a surgical strike on the Yongbyon nuclear reactor, the plutonium reactor that had produced some fissile material for nuclear weapons, but there had been no demonstrated nuclear weapon capability yet in North Korea. But we were afraid, even then, back in the 90s, that we could only make the plant sort of broken for a couple of years and they'd rebuild it. And by the way, we might have fissile material on the loose. Mm-hmm. So that wasn't going to be very cool with China or with the South Koreans or even North Korea. So it was not a good option. And we're all boxed in. We can't change the regime by force. They can't, they won't give up their nuclear weapons freely. So we're going to have to find some way to contain this problem at lower cost. And that includes a strong alliance where our allies are doing more, but where the United States remains steadily engaged. No mixed signals about our engagement and our commitment.
Mm-hmm. And can you maybe just comment briefly on, what you've seen historically and what you believe to be the role of the executive branch, but also of the Congress, specifically the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Relations Committee, members of both parties in maintaining and strengthening those alliances of which you spoke?
Well, Congress plays a critical role in alliance strength and management, because we have a bipartisan consensus. We've had it for decades on the role that we've played and the fact that we need strong, capable, like-minded allies and partners. And Congress really can play such a useful role in the, whether it's not just the Appropriations Committee passing special actions to reassure the Indo-Pacific, which is what they're talking about right now, but it's also the Foreign Relations Committees, the diplomats, it's the development action that makes sure that we're engaged in dialogue, that we're building up networks of like-minded leaders in civil society, not just in government, to make sure that we're working together and rowing toward the same direction. So this is absolutely critical what Congress can do on alliances and partners. It's also one of our strengths that even if some officials, whether it's in the executive branch or the legislative branch, are speaking ill of our allies and partners, you'll find many more speaking very positively about them, because we know overall, and this is proven by polls, whether it's Pew or others, there's strong support in the American body politic on both sides of the aisle for our allies in Asia Pacific, mm-hmm. and in Europe for that matter.
I want to just shift gears just ever so slightly. We've got about 10 minutes left, and just encourage folks to continue sending in questions. If there's one more thing that you want to ask, please go ahead and send that to us. But we're getting a lot of questions on the pandemic. And so I want to kind of shift to that for the remainder of our time. And again, I'm going to kind of try to combine a few here, but Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is, the United States' top infectious disease expert, as most of us know, said earlier today that we could see as many, we being the United States, as 100,000 new cases per day, which is 2.5 times the current rate of infection. We saw about 2 weeks ago in Beijing the testing of hundreds of thousands of people, mobilizing 100,000 community workers to test everybody who had been and had visited a market, in Beijing. Can you just kind of at a high level talk about, actions that that the Chinese government has taken to try to contain, halt or contain this second wave of coronavirus? How that compares with, what you have seen the United States doing, and then I think that'll kind of lead to some more questions from there.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think originally when we sort of arranged to do this talk, it was on the basis of an article that I wrote with my wife, Professor Audrey Cronin, calling for recognition that U.S. public health and international cooperation were national security issues, and that the United States had a lot to learn from Asian Pacific countries, even while we had a lot to worry about as well from this coronavirus. I have great respect for Dr. Anthony Fauci. I had the pleasure of getting to work with him on occasion back when I was number 3 official at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and we were making headway on major international health programs around the world for HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis. And I have great respect for the science that he's trying to put forward. But public policy is a difficult thing in a democracy. It's amazing, in China, where you control the levers of information, and it's all about information control, we really just cannot trust the data. We cannot trust the regime in Beijing. We can't trust the numbers. But I do trust the numbers out of Taiwan, where only 7 have died, right next door to the mainland with their 23 million population. I trust the numbers in, Indonesia, a population of 268 million, where about 3,000 people have died. Vietnam, I'm very bullish on Vietnam, but I don't trust their number that nobody has died. That's the same number that North Korea claims. I just suspect that's not true. South Korea, another close ally, which was hit early with the virus, only 300 people have died. That shows us that this virus, is contagious as it is, can be limited. Now, I know the South Koreans, for instance, are playing a game of whack-a-mole, but they have learned from previous pandemics and epidemics that they can track and trace and then quarantine sort of by compartmentalizing the problem wherever it pops up. So whack-a-mole may not work in counterinsurgency, but it works pretty well in a pandemic until you can develop the therapies and vaccine to put this on the other side of the problem. Basic interventions, masks, for instance, it's been proven now in the studies. We have more data, we have more science. The Chinese and Asian cultures in general have no problem using masks in public, and that's been a big part of their ability to resume some normalcy and some work, resume the economy, without having to close everything down. Korea never closed everything down. China did close things down for 10 weeks in many cities, and it continues to impose some strict quarantines along the border and other places where the virus has popped up, including in the Beijing markets this past month. Mm-hmm. But while I don't believe all the Chinese data, it's a good thing that the World Health Organization is finally getting scientists over there to talk further about the origins and about how they're fighting a second wave. We don't know, we cannot predict, and I think Dr. Fauci would be the first one to say this, and I think he has been, that we don't know exactly how bad a second wave could get. Some people have likened the whole coronavirus to more of a fire, and the fire will, ebb and flow. That's the wrong metaphor, but the point is it will subside or rise, for months to come while we work on therapies and vaccines and eventually get this under control. But China has had a major problem. They had many more deaths than they reported, but they have a serious public health system, that serves the political party, and it's not one that's we would want or want to adopt, but there's certainly things we can learn from them about fighting this, and obviously some level of cooperation on pandemics makes common sense. So we have to figure out what the balance is between cooperation with China on this pandemic and where they're trying to sneak in or actually do us harm, because there are people in the Chinese Communist Party who are happily preparing to do harm to our system at the same time. So we cannot be naive about what the Chinese are doing, but we also have to figure out a way for humans to cooperate on something that could literally devastate the planet if we didn't. Not necessarily this COVID-19, but future pandemics could be even worse.
Patrick, in your recent report, a global survey of U.S.-China competition in the coronavirus era, you touch on the misinformation campaign, some of the cyber attacks coming out of China, the militarization efforts in the South China Sea. Could you touch on that briefly, and also talk about the success and or failures of international diplomacy to hold China accountable, and the role that you see the U.S. having in this going forward?
Yes, more. I mean, one of the early disinformation campaigns, out of North Korea, back when it was fighting with the Chinese, was an accusation that the United States used biological weapons against the North Koreans. It was not true, but it lingers to this day as part of the narrative. It is strikingly and eerily resembling the accusation that Chinese foreign ministry official made earlier this year, claiming that the U.S. Army brought the pandemic to Asia. That is, as you would recognize, Maura, just blatant disinformation. Now, we don't have to believe it, and it's being overwhelmed by other facts and other news, but it also lingers out there. These terrible lies have a way of creeping into your psyche, and a lot of it is oriented towards psychological effect. You're not sure. You start to doubt yourself. But the reality is, we don't know where this coronavirus, actually was created. We assume it was in a wet market, but maybe it was in a biolab, or maybe it was not even China. We still don't know those facts. But in the meantime, it hasn't stopped the Chinese Global Times, their sort of tabloid press, if you will, that is the feisty punching bag. America's the punching bag of the Global Times. Their foreign ministry has taken this very pugnacious orientation called wolf warrior diplomacy, and they're happy to blame the United States for everything. And granted, the Trump administration has punched back and it's fought very hard, and it's sort of brought out the troops and the information as well. But I think there's more evidence in the Trump administration's case initially about how China dealt with this than on the Chinese punch back. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't help us get over the pandemic. We still have to deal with the pandemic. We still have to deal with the economic fallout of the pandemic. So let's stick to the facts and the truth. And that's why we have to respect things like the Johns Hopkins website and Dr. Fauci, and we have to give them the means. If you think about the parallels between dealing with the flashpoints I talked about and dealing with the pandemic, you have similar types of approaches. I mean, you need the same early warning. So we need the intelligence community to be intelligent and accurate about these flashpoints, but we also need the CDC to be effective. We need some international institution like the World Health Organization to be effective, to be early sort of warning signs. We need to be able to do the crisis management when the crisis arises, because we will have crises and we have to get through them. Crisis management, though, is just a sliver of what we do. We want long-term solutions, and we need resilience for that. We need investments in public health. We need investments in defense. We can't have everything, though, so we're going to have to make tough trade-offs as we think about them, and we're going to have to rely upon allies and partners and other institutions as well. That's where the strategy comes in. Our strategy for resilience here needs to take into account that we're mobilizing others to work with us toward a common purpose. Whether it's deterring Chinese aggression against Taiwan, whether it's shining a spotlight on Chinese assertiveness on Hong Kong or in the South China Sea, whether it's working with India, Japan, and Australia to stand up for a free and open Indo-Pacific, or whether it's standing with other allies and partners around the world and institutions to fight this pandemic and to prevent future pandemics from wiping out our economy. All of those things are manageable, and I'm I'm a great optimist, and I think with the people of the Granite State and the rest of the Americans, working with allies and partners around the world, we can manage these challenges simultaneously.
Well, I think that that note of optimism is a great one to wrap up on. Patrick, this has been just absolutely wonderful having you here. And I know I'm speaking for everyone who's joined us live, and I can tell just by the rapid inflow of questions that we're receiving here, the amount of engagement from all around New Hampshire, from Nashua, Keene, Manchester, here on the Seacoast where I am, the Lakes region. It's just really exciting to see how many people have turned out to engage in this discussion. We want to thank you for joining us. We hope next time you will be able to join us live, and that we can take you live to the shipyard and Building 86 to see the Peace Trees room. I think that would be really, really special, and something that, certainly I think you'd enjoy, and your family has certainly given so much to this country. So thank you very much for your service, your engagement, and your family's service. And I'd also, just in wrapping up, like to thank everybody for watching. We really appreciate you joining us tonight, staying on for this entire session. Please be sure to keep an eye out for a number of the events that we're going to be doing in the fall. We not sure yet if they will be live or virtual, but they will be happening. And we look forward to continue to engage with you then, and continuing to bring these very important discussions to the people of New Hampshire. So with that, we're going to sign off. And Patrick, thank you, and everybody have a terrific evening.
Thank you so much.